Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Stanley, and welcome to the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast, where our mission is to bring you insights that help you as a sales leader bridge the knowing and doing gap. And joining me today is, of course, my co-host, Stephen Rosen. And Stephen, I know we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and I think it's one of yours, but probably a little bit more my favorite.
Well, Colleen, it's a very relevant topic and one hopefully I'll learn from you. I know you have a tremendous amount of experience and expertise in emotional intelligence. And I think there's an incredible relevance to today's business environment where reps are knocking on doors, they're making calls, there's all types of rejection. We want to explore the importance of resilience in sales. The question is, I always think, is it nature or is it nurture? But can resiliency actually be learned or developed within a sales organization?
And it's a good question because I think a lot of times people think it's innate, but the research shows it can be learned. Now, Stephen, just like anything else, resiliency is kind of like a muscle. So if you don't use it as a manager, if you're not reinforcing it, it's going to atrophy there. There's a few things that managers can do to build these resilient organizations. When we go in and teach emotional intelligence for sales workshops, the first competency we teach, particularly if the area is resiliency, is emotional regulation. How do you connect the dots there? Here's what happens. If you're an individual that constantly gets emotionally triggered all day long, whether you're a sales leader or sales manager, at the end of the day, you're defeated and depleted, right? Vince Lombardi, the great NFL coach, had a great statement. He said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." I've always likened this to like a garden hose, that if you're an individual that every time an emotional trigger comes up, it pokes a hole in that hose, well, that water goes leaking out. Replace water with energy. And so as a human being, if your energy is always directed towards being mad or upset, the energy isn't directed towards getting something done, which actually lowers stress and improves resiliency and sales outcomes.
Wow. Well, so tell me specifically what you do in a workshop to help sales reps get better at dealing with that, those emotional triggers. Is there a formula for that that some of our sales leaders can use when they're coaching salespeople?
So what's interesting is the skill that's behind emotional regulation and improving it is emotional self-awareness, right? So that which you're not aware of, you cannot change. So you have to, first of all, teach them the power of self-awareness, which is built through carving out quiet time every day. And nobody wants to do it. They use the excuse, I have monkey brain. And I will come back and say, everybody has monkey brain. But anytime you're developing a new habit, it takes time. The second thing is, Stephen, my perception is you probably didn't get as lit up as I did in my youth. And so what I
Hold on. What does that mean, lit up?
oh, I could go from 0 to 100 miles an hour and then leave bloody bodies on the way. Now,
Oh my God, Colleen, not you.
well, there's a reason you study emotional intelligence. You may need it. And so
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And it's like all the kids that take psychology and then think that everything applies to them.
exactly. And so one of the things we teach under the emotional self-awareness is be aware of it, but also then you've got to put a pause in. So you're aware that you're starting to emotionally react. And the biggest thing you do is put a pause in your response. Sometimes that's simply reframing the situation by, it could be this simple of a question. What else is going on here? What else could be true? What's informing this person? When you put the pause in, you actually take all of that emotion, which is happening in that amygdala reptilian brain, and now you're able to access your prefrontal cortex, which is the smart brain. And that allows you to do and say what you're supposed to do.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And then the other one that's interesting, we will also teach people how to identify self-limiting beliefs or how to tap into the power of beliefs. And that actually falls under another EQ umbrella, which is optimism. Now, here's what's interesting. There is solid research to show that optimistic sales teams outperform pessimistic sales team. Well, let's unpack why. Is first of all, optimistic people absolutely have this belief that when adversity hits, something good is going to come out of it.
Mm.
When you can have that belief, like what's good about this? Where am I going to get the gift or the lesson? That allows you to keep pushing through the adversity instead of getting buried by it. The second belief that they have is they can control the outcome. This is called internal locus of control. And I know you've seen this, Stephen, with good sales leaders and how you're coaching them to coach their people. Focus on what you can control, because if you're always focusing, especially in sales, on what's not in your control, the economy, interest rates, marketing doesn't provide enough leads, we have too high a pricing, we don't have enough branding. Well, if you focus there, obviously you're going to be stressed because maybe those are things you can't control. But in sales, there's a lot you can control. I can control practice. I can control revisiting my ideal client profile. I can control asking for advice, mentoring, role playing. I can do more activity, different activity. When we focus on what we can control, that actually reduces stress. And then when you're not stressed, you can be creative and all those good things that create more sales.
I love the way you explain that. That's very insightful.
Yeah. So,
Well,
Stephen, in your years of coaching, resiliency can, I think it sounds like one of these good topics, but does it actually produce hard sales results? Because we're in a business where you're just supposed to grind, right? But have you ever seen where true resiliency, in the context of which I've set out, where it's actually translated to hard dollars?
Well, here's the thing. It's very interesting. I'm going to share in a story. I was working with a client and their sales team, and we noticed that there was one objection that customers kept throwing at them. And sometimes it was 2 or 3 times a day. Ever the customer raised that specific objection about their product, this is what would happen. Their chin would go to their chest. You're basically saying that you got me. Sometimes we'll use the submarine approach where they'll ping. They're just testing to see respond, but their body language was immediately they were defeated. They're thinking in their minds, don't ask me that question. Don't ask me that question. So we said, how can we help you? We found a study that was done by one of their competitors that showed equal incidence of this problem with their product and the competitor's product.
Interesting.
We had some data there. So we trained the reps on 2 things, or we coached them. Actually, the managers coached them. One, that they knew the data. When the production came up, part of it was how they responded, right? You had never used the word resiliency until I learned it from you. But the concept was, first of all, when you're asked the question, you respond with chest out, chin up, head forward, right? With confidence that they would quote the competitor's data. It may not be product related. It was in healthcare. It may just be related to normal issues that people face. So the question you asked me, so one, it was a change in mentality. They were like a punching bag initially. That complaint or objection would come up, they'd get punched 2 or 3 times a day. They're already going for the knockout blow, and the next punch, they're going to go home and cry. So 1, they were able to respond with confidence. 2, they were very conscious of their body language when they responded. And so the question you asked me, how does it translate into hard dollars? Okay, this product, I don't know if it was number 3 in the marketplace or 2, it became the number 1 bestseller in the category. I'm not saying that was the reason why. If there's a certain perception of your product, and as a sales rep, you don't change that because you feel that it's an issue, then you're not very resilient. So we taught body language, which I'm sure as part of that emotional intelligence, but also not getting yourself tied up in, oh, I'm hearing that objection again, but actually hearing it and saying, wow, I've got a response from you.
That falls right under 2 other skills that sales leaders can teach. So if you want to put the framing as it backs up to EQ, number 1, with a lot of the research out there, is that it's your perspective that changes your ability to deal with adversity, right? There was a couple of things you did with your coaching there. First of all, the perspective was you normalize the difficulty. Like when you showed them data that everyone else is facing the same objections, you normalize the difficulty. And often when you normalize the difficulty of learning or life, then when you normalize something, they just expect it. You lowered that emotional trigger because you normalized it there. Secondly, with the nonverbal, that's actually in the EQ world called emotional expression. So it's not so much what you say, it's literally is your face, is your tonality relaying confidence. So they started getting better results because they were able to manage, frankly, that emotional trigger. So that's a great story. And it happens all over in the sales process there. One tiny area was blowing the entire sales call, wasn't it?
Well, the poor rep was deflated, right? All the water came out of their hose. If you got 2 or 3 of those calls in a day, you were finished. You were heading home at 2:00 just because it was so defeated. So we helped them turn that around. Within organizations, a lot of money is spent on sales training. There should be much more spent in areas like leadership development. What can sales leaders do on the area of emotional intelligence, because sales is very much a game of attitude, mindset, emotional intelligence. You said emotional awareness. So what can organizations do, or what have you done with organizations to help them really get better at this internal game?
Well, so one thing I coach a lot of either CEOs or sales leaders is incorporate teaching soft skills into your onboarding process, particularly resiliency. In fact, what's interesting, there's a stat out there that American companies in leadership positions note that 20% of their success is going to come from their ability to be resilient. If we're not actually teaching people what is resiliency, some specific skills by which they can be more resilient, you can have the greatest sales training program out there, methodology, but often, again, when you're not feeling resilient, you lack the ability, you lack the confidence, you lack the energy to execute the right selling skills methodology every day. So I really encourage people to take a look at your onboarding process, because half the time they're worried more about getting them set up in their 401k, which is important, by the way, in insurance, but incorporate it. This is how we roll around here.
I'm fascinated by this because in my experience when I was a VP of sales, I wasn't necessarily directly involved in the onboarding, but it was okay. They need to understand our products. They need to understand our selling process.
Right, right.
I don't think we spend any time on emotional intelligence. You really have good stats, and you may know this one. What percentage of companies are doing that right now? I mean, everyone should be doing it, is what I'm hearing.
I don't know the stats and the number of companies. Obviously, we get hired because that's what I teach, emotional intelligence for sales. Sometimes, Stephen, they actually don't know that it's going to produce a hard result, but they know enough to say, hey, I think my team needs something else. And what happens here generally is that there's a gap. So they taught really good sales training by a very good instructor, but the team isn't consistently executing the behaviors. Or even the sales leader has learned the tactical skills of territory and account management, but they're blowing up coaching calls. They're blowing up group meetings because they're lacking the ability to read the situation, maybe lacking empathy and assertiveness. Maybe they have low impulse control. So the ones may either have seen it already or they just know, hey, this isn't working.
That's an important message to get out, as far as I'm concerned, that we're all very concerned about technical skills and what have you, but soft skills are just so important, and they're hard to measure, right?
Well, and they're actually showing up with this onset of artificial intelligence. I was reading an article the other day and they were saying that we're hiring people, they want artificial intelligence expertise, even in the sales roles, but they also want interpersonal skills. Because regardless, you're going to have to work with people. So interpersonal skills obviously fall under the EQ skills there.
I'm going to throw another question at you.
Sure.
Because again, I think this is fascinating. And again, I don't know if you have a stat, so I'm putting you on the spot here again. Intuitively, I would guess that most top performers are very strong in emotional intelligence skills, whether it be resiliency, self-awareness. What's your response?
There are some stats out there. So in Dr. Seligman and Dr. Kellerman's work, they found that companies that scored higher in resiliency, which meant that their leaders were resilient, there's a trickle-down effect there, they had a 3.2 higher year-over-year growth. And they see that when you think about it, when you've got a resilient leader, they're modeling resiliency. And from the term emotional contagion, people catch that emotion and they're like, well, if my leader's resilient, they're not letting the environment get them down, the economy get them down. I won't either. That modeling of behavior actually creates more resiliency. I remember, Stephen, way back when I got started in this business. So I was an associate for a Sandler franchisee. The owner of the franchise, Gary, was going off to close a $100,000 deal. He was back in the office about 30 minutes later, and I went, what happened? And this was my first year in this business. And he looked at me and he said, well, went to the appointment and they had to sadly tell me that they were being put up for sale. So they were getting acquired. I said, oh, and then he looked at me and he said, some will, some won't, moving on. He did not miss a beat. Now, I'm telling you that story 23 years later because it impacted me, because I thought, oh, surely he's going to be mad for a couple of days, depressed. I'm telling you, unless I missed something after hours, but some will, some won't, moving on. But what's interesting, if you knew the backstory on this gentleman, he grew up in a very tough environment. So he had had some adversity training in his youth. He had a father that was absent, and when he was present, wasn't a great guy. When I was kind of putting the pieces together, he had learned a lot of resiliency somewhere in his background. He had been trained for it. Going back to your question as well, what can sales leaders do? I think also a big one that we've got to continue taking a look at, especially in this remote working environment, is building communities. This really came to light for me after reading a book titled What Happened to You. It's authored by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. Now, I was reading it more for my nonprofit work because Dr. Bruce Perry is the foremost authority on trauma. So I'm reading, and Oprah addresses the question. She says, hey, listen, our ancestors had a lot of trauma. I mean, we had dinosaurs, they're being eaten, there's plagues, there was no medicine. How did
Right.
we survive? Well, he gave 4 reasons, but one that I want to bring up to our audience today,
Please.
the number one reason people thrived was community. One child may have 4 to 6 adults raising them, and you traveled in tribes. When you take a look today, I think something that's very important is that sales leaders build community. And we saw that with a prior interview we had on our podcast with Brandon Nye. He was like, we've got elders, and this VP of sales expects the elders to mentor. I believe when you've got an elder, you've got a mentor, we're all in this together, that builds resiliency and such. So I'd really encourage managers, what are you doing to build community out there? And that's where you still have the in-person meetings. Maybe you assign a mentor. In group meetings, if you've got a veteran, you have them show up and contribute because they have a lot of the wisdom that can shortcut the learnings of new people in the industry or young professionals.
And also they can share stories where not everything is rosy, right? We have ups and downs and we continue to grow, but sometimes the road to success is paved with potholes and we need to find ways to just get past them.
Well, and how many group sales meetings have the agenda come to share and share one of your biggest failures in the last 2 months? What you do is normalize failure, but then you also are at a point where you can kind of laugh about it. You said that during a call? Oh my gosh. And so,
I love it.
humor is a great stress decreaser. And when you're decreasing stress, you're increasing resiliency. So, Stephen, since you obviously have a big coaching practice, any favorite resiliency questions that you ask of your sales leaders or teach your sales leaders so they can build that muscle within their sales team?
I'm going to share one with you, but I'd also like to hear your take on it. As you described, when people come together and they share their failures, part of it is reflection on a situation, and not only the situation, how they reacted to the situation.
Yes.
Emotional awareness, self-awareness. So part of it is just starting to understand how you react, what your triggers are. One of the questions I suggest managers ask one of their reps is experienced failure, rejection, which we all experience, right? And ask them very simply to think about a situation that a failure or place they were rejected. How did they feel? And then what are they going to do next time it happens? You have a going forward plan that if someone's put their business up for sale or budgets have been cut, it may have happened to you once or twice. I know it's happened to me. Is okay, so how are you going to respond next time? Are you going to take it personally? How are you going to react? And I think some of it's just getting the rep to self-reflect. And if the reaction is, oh my God, why didn't I do this sooner? You got to help them put in perspective and analyze the situation. So, how do you feel when this happens? And then what are you going to do so you're not feeling that way next time it happens?
Yes. I think that's a great strategy because if you want the EQ terms, that's self-awareness. Because again, that what you're not aware of, you're bound to repeat. And this is why some people are just on that gerbil wheel where they're triggered every week by the same events. Coach people on the event is not going to go away. A person's not going to go away. A situation's not going to go away. Like your example, an objection is not going to go away. So what can you do? Well, learn how to either preempt the objection or deal with the objection, right? Yeah.
And how you respond.
That's the only thing you are in control of is the response.
I used to think, your chin, look at your body language with their team. And you can just see, now you could just see it in their face. It's like, oh my God, I'm getting hit again. You're always a wealth of knowledge. And I don't know if you have a favorite question that you ask when you're teaching sales leaders how to better coach resilience.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I do. One that I will ask them is, and you have to do this in the right context of empathy, assertiveness, the situation. But the question I will coach is, what part of this do you need to own? Let's go back to your great example of the objection. Part of owning that is objections are often predictable. So predictable, it's fixable or it's preventable. In the resiliency world, if you don't own it, you can't change it. And so I like to have high ownership teams. Well, you know what? I actually didn't do enough pre-call planning. I got a little complacent here. I could have asked for more coaching. Now, there are definitely times where the person might say, I don't know. And that literally falls into that learning that only happens. Sometimes you just got to take a face plant and get the lesson. And then you go, what's the lesson learned here? And how will it serve you moving forward? Because what I've seen is if you can make a lesson truly look like a gift, oh, okay, I screwed up this call, I failed, whatever the words you want to use. But then if they look at it, but now I know, that's actually a gift that they get to take into the next meeting, which puts a different frame around it. Like, okay. And then I think if you do the sharing of failures at sales meetings, all of a sudden they're not feeling like they're the only one that doesn't know what they're doing. They're probably looking at a top producer and never heard that the person got hung up on real
Yeah.
practice proposals, etc. So I think those are, what do you own? What's the lesson learned? How will that lesson serve you moving forward?
I'm going to try that. I've never, ever, and I mean this in my 30-year career in sales leadership and helping develop leaders, ever had one of those failure roundtables. What I have done is always build on successes and then share my observations of things we can do better. But next time I have a group learning session, I'm committed to trying that and seeing how it goes and how people feel, and maybe warning people in advance that I'm going to call upon you to share a failure. But I think they're all great learnings. And that's what we're trying to do, is help people learn to get better, right? We're always going to make mistakes. How do we improve?
And just one more point on that failure, I would follow it up with, what's the lesson learned? I always encourage people, when you've got some of these big downturns, and you and I've been through them, 9/11, 2008, COVID, you probably even remember the crazy .com crash in the late 90s. During those times, I encourage people to read books of people that have experienced adversity. And you might go back in history, because when you start learning their stories and what they went through, it also puts it in perspective, like, wow,
Right. It's not
I'm
so
going
bad.
through some stuff, but this isn't so bad. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. I say this with all excitement and learning. Another insightful episode of the Sales Leadership Podcast. We both hope that you've gathered some strategies and some tactics that you can do to help close the gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it. I think helping your salespeople and as a leader, teaching resiliency is really important. And it's an essential quality that can transform your sales team and help you achieve much greater success.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Always great to co-host with you.
Thank you, Colleen.